Okay, you see the presentation? Okay.
Yeah.
So you see the title, you see my name, you see the date. I want to give some general information, some general features of the Serbian Orthodox Church, and then in the second part come more concretely to the question about the West. It will be quite condensed, I fear, because of the lack of time, but that is due to the situation in which we are, and it's better to have a short presentation in the internet than a very long one. The Serbian Orthodox Church is one of the autocephalous, which means independent Orthodox churches, and it has its center in Serbia, but many faithful also in other parts of former Yugoslavia. There's also a large diaspora of Serbs in Europe and overseas. The church has some 8 million faithful, which live in 40 dioceses, most of them in Serbia and the Balkan region. Here you can see the ones in former Yugoslavia. You see here, here is Belgrade with the Patriarchate, Serbia here, and then the area Bosnia and Croatia and Slovenia. And of course, you have also dioceses in, as you can see here, in Romania, in Hungary, Austria, Switzerland, and Germany, and so on. The next to the most of you probably will be in Düsseldorf, the one which is in charge for Germany. And the diocese in charge for the Netherlands and for Benelux and France is in Paris. The Serbian, as Alphonse just mentioned, the Serbian Orthodox Church is going through a transition right now. 10 days ago, exactly, a new patriarch was elected. And as you heard, the old patriarch Irene had died in November because of COVID-19. I heard yesterday that the new patriarch is in quarantine right now, because he has had contact with people who also have asymptomatic COVID-19. The old patriarch was in high age, he was 90 years old, but he was not the first Serbian bishop who died as a consequence of the pandemic. I said the new patriarch is Porfirie. I said he was, and you can read here, he was elected, but in fact he was not elected, but he was drawn by lot. The Assembly of Bishops elects 3 candidates. They put the names into 3 envelopes, they mix the envelopes, and then a monk picks one of the envelopes and reads out the name. Then Metropolitan, now Patriarch Porfirie, was the youngest of the three candidates. He is 56 years old, and he will most probably be the leader of the Serbian Orthodox Church for the years to come. In the last 6 years, Porfirie has been the Metropolitan, the Bishop of Zagreb in Croatia. He is the first patriarch who was born after the Second World War. So he's more than 30 years younger than his predecessor. I want to give you some features, some characteristics of the Serbian Orthodox Church. One point is that the Serbian Orthodox Church has had a stormy history in the last decades. The country in which the church existed changed several times, from Yugoslavia until Serbia today, and it always became smaller. It always lost parts of its territories. There were several wars in which Serbia was involved, and there are difficult relations with many of the neighboring countries and nations. All this happened after 40 years of communism, since 1945, in which the church could not develop an attitude towards modernity, as it was in fact confined to the church buildings and was limited to serving liturgy. And it had not a proper place in society, neither had it the possibility to develop such a place. As you know, Yugoslavia fell apart in bloody wars in the 1990s. In those years, a lot of attention was dedicated to the Serbian Orthodox Church, which was frequently labeled as being nationalistic. Zagreb, where the new patriarch was bishop the last 6 or 7 years, is the capital not only of a neighboring country to Serbia, but also of a country with which Serbia was at war in the 1990s. I mentioned the large Serbian diaspora. A part of these people came in the 1970s to Western Europe as migrant workers. Others were refugees in the 1990s and stayed here. But many others, many Serbs, never left their homes, and nevertheless, they are abroad today in a different country, not in Serbia, like in Croatia or in Bosnia, where Serbs had lived for centuries. So that is one more aspect, faithful living in different states. And there is still a debate on Kosovo, which is claimed by Serbia as a province belonging to Serbia, but many states, many other states recognize it as an independent state. However, other states have not yet recognized the independence of Kosovo. Even some European Union members like Spain or Greece or Cyprus, Romania and Slovakia. So there is even no clear consensus about the borders of Serbia. A special ecclesial problem, or actually two ecclesial problems exist with regard to Northern Macedonia and to Montenegro, but you will learn later more about that from colleague Vladimir Cvetkovic, who will talk about that. And one more aspect, yeah, well, that is, I just mentioned that. And one more aspect is, which I think Radi Kisic will be speaking about that, but I just want to mention is, there was no tradition of ecumenical encounter and of ecumenical exchange and dialogue in what used to be Yugoslavia. It was very rarely that representatives of the churches met, and that had also impact and influence of the events which happened, which came later and which happened during the 1990s. So what we can see is the Serbian Orthodox Church has a very unstable recent past. After a time of suppression and marginalization, it came gradually back into the focus. In this situation, it had to situate itself towards many questions and challenges. The church had to develop a relationship to the outside world, to state, to nation, to other religious communities. And one actor, one aspect in the outside world is the West. And it's put already in the title of this presentation in quotation marks. So the first question we have to ask is, what is the West? When we talk about the West, first of all, it has nothing to do with geography. It is not in the geographical sense, but rather we have two different perspectives. One is the political perspective of West. It is about the system. Yugoslavia, as you know, had been a socialist country, but it was a very special one because it did not belong to the Eastern Bloc and always had a special position. You might remember, or the older ones among you might remember, that Yugoslavia was one of the most important members in the, so we call it the bloc-free countries, the non-aligned countries, as a third group between the like capitalist Western countries and the socialist countries. So it was somehow in between. But it was also clear that it was not a Western country, but also not belonging to the traditional communist countries. Now, in the 1990s, communism was not a real option anymore. But the Western systems, the capitalistic system, brought along also a lot of disadvantages, like poverty for many people, social insecurity, and so on. And most importantly, it brought war. Nationalism came up or came back as a consequence of a non-processed past, and it was readily accepted by many people as a replacement for the former ideology. In this regard, the Serbian Orthodox Church saw the West, the political system of the West, as something which was hostile and unwelcome. In the second sense, the religious sense, West means the Western churches, above all the Roman Catholic Church. It's interesting that the Protestant churches, which do exist in Serbia as smaller groups, they are not so much in focus. It is the Roman Catholic Church, and the Roman Catholic Church mostly is perceived as a Croatian church. And that is a mutual perception. The Croats, when Croats speak about Roman Catholic Croats, speak about Orthodoxy, they do not think about Russia and Greece and Romania, but about the Serbs. So Orthodoxy is perceived as Serbian, and Catholicism in Serbia is perceived as Croat. I had during the war in the early 1990s a meeting with a Roman Catholic bishop from Croatia, who was the one maybe some of you will remember him, Srećko Badurina from Šibenik. And he was very open-minded. He was interested in having contacts to the Serbian church and so on. And so we talked, and one day he told me, he said, you know, I read a book about Orthodoxy, which was a Italian translation from a Russian book. And it was so, I liked it so much. It was so interesting, and the spirituality, and it is so good. It can be so helpful for us, and so on. And I didn't dare to say it, but I thought to myself, my dear Bishop, you could have read so many books about Orthodoxy in your own language, in Serbia. I mean, in a very similar language. You don't need an Italian translation of a Russian book. But the interesting point is they did not see, or they did not perceive Orthodoxy as the Serbian element, but then it came via translations and via other countries, and it is similarly the other way around. So the Serbs have less problems with Catholics when they are Italian, Spanish, Dutch, and Croats have less problems with Greeks, Russians, Romanians, Bulgarians, and so on. That shows that the problems are not only religious, but they are mixed with national, political, historical, and other aspects. We can find a strong anti-Western resentment in the Serbian Orthodox Church. But I want to make a disclaimer. What do I mean when I say the Serbian Orthodox Church? What we see and what we mostly have is the patriarch and the bishops, its influential priests and theologians, above all those who work in the theological faculty of Belgrade University. However, one must say that the Serbian Orthodox Church is in a certain way split. In all these groups, among the bishops, among priests, among theologians, you can find people with a very skeptical position towards the West, and others who think the Western ideas and the Western way of thinking is important and fruitful for the Serbian Orthodox Church. Here's Rade Kisic, my friend and colleague, who has done his PhD in a Catholic theological faculty in Germany, and who is a professor in the same faculty in which some of his colleagues are very reluctant towards Catholicism and towards the West, towards Germany, and so on. So when I will be talking now about the criticism of the West, we should be aware that it is never the whole church, but just a portion. It's an important portion, and it's a loud one, but it's a part of the church. Which are the main points which are criticized in the West? How is the West seen? The Western thinking, that's what these people, the critics say, is overemphasizing the human aspect and underestimates the divine dimension. So the human aspect is more important, and the divine aspect is underestimated. Therefore, reason and the thinking, human thinking, come to the foreground, and the rational wins over the spiritual. This kind of thinking, so the human, or regarding the human as more important, leads to a misbalance with regard to Jesus Christ, where we accentuate the human nature and not the divine. So Jesus Christ is man and God at the same time, and according to this, I'm referring, of course, this theory or this vision. According to it, it is in Orthodoxy perfectly balanced, the human and the divine, and the West has the tendency to overemphasize the human aspect and to disregard or to regard too little the divine aspect. The Christian dogma requires an equilibrium between both, and the West has made him human and forgot about the divine. And that has also consequences for the vision of the church when we think about what the church is. The church is, according to the Orthodox tradition, a divine and human body at the same time. The West, so it is said, sees the church only as a congregation of human beings. It neglects the divine essence and makes it an organization as everyone else. This theological attitude, so the problem of the disbalance between the human and the divine, comes from a certain direction in the Orthodox theology, which has been very strong for a couple of decades, and which also underlines very much monasticism and asceticism. Alfons Brüning just mentioned the most influential Serbian theologian, or one of the most influential in the 20th century, Justin Popovic. He was a representative of this direction, and he had impact on many bishops who are today in charge. This idea has, in this specific perspective a lot of consequences. Western rationalism has produced a very effective way of life, but it has forgotten about its spiritual roots. As I said, the spiritual side is missing. The Western Christianity is characterized by a perfect organization. That's especially how the Roman Catholic Church is seen, or by an absolute worldliness, as Protestantism is seen. When you have this idea that the West theologically is characterized by a disbalance between the human and the divine, then it is not about single points in the creed where the Western churches are wrong, but it is the West is being completely on the wrong path. It's a wrong way, a wrong direction, which the West took. The West allegedly has abandoned the common ground for the Christian belief as we can find it in the Church Fathers and in the first centuries of the Church. The Orthodox Church, however, according to these positions, has preserved the balance which the West has lost. And the consequences of these are the loss of Christian identity, secularization, a democracy is critically seen, and Western Europe allegedly has shown that it claims certain values, but does not stick to them when its economic and other interests are in question. That is very frequently a narrative you can find in connection to the wars of the 1990s. In the last 3 minutes, I want to add a big but. First, we have to ask ourselves, when we look at these elements, which I just presented in a couple of minutes, we have to ask what of them is Serbian and what is in general Orthodox. We find very similar narratives, especially the ones about the religious aspect, also in Russian, in the Greek, or in other Orthodox churches. So many of that is not a specific Serbian aspect, but a broader question which concerns Orthodox Western relations in general. It's not typical, so to say, for the Serbs, but you have very similar discussions with, you can have very similar discussions with Greek or Russian theologians. A second point, many Serbs would believe in such a narrative about the superiority of their own religious culture in regard to the Western religious culture, but that does not prevent them from having a high opinion about the West and from seeing Western Europe as a place where not only one lives better, but where also many things are much better. So you have at the same time this fundamental criticism and a kind of admiration of the West. And you get very confusing results, for example, in surveys, in public surveys, when a majority of Serbs will express the opinions that Serbia should be much closer to Russia, but at the same time, they would like to have a working place in the European Union and to have the economic advantages which you can get in the European Union. A third point is that this kind of skepticism is not only present in the church, but also in Serbian society. Surveys show, as I just mentioned, that a large portion of the population is very in favor of a Western integration of the country, but one also can find a high degree of people who think that Serbia should be in close relationship, especially with Russia, and that the path toward Europe is a wrong one. So it's not, I think this is a very important misperception by European authorities and by European structures that everybody is very happy to join the European Union as quickly as possible. In Serbia, you can find, even in also in the society, not only in the church, a relatively high degree of skepticism. And my last point I would like to mention, which seems to me very important after many years of having studied the between intranational and the inter-religious relationships in the Balkan, I think a very important point is a complete disagreement about history among the people involved. When you ask someone who is Serbian and who is Croat about the common history, starting from the settlement of the Balkans in the 6th and 7th century until the wars of the 1990s, you will have a complete completely different vision in almost every point. I think I can, if you're interested and you ask questions, I can give you examples about that in the discussion when we have the discussion. Thank you very much for your interest and for your patience.